Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Griffith University, the Asia Pacific Centre for Sustainable Enterprise. My name is Jeremy Williams and I'm the Director of the Centre. And as is custom, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting tonight. I'd also like to pay my respect to the elders past and present and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians who are here today. Before I introduce our guest speaker tonight, I would like to engage, if you'll indulge me please, a bit of shameless advertising. You've all been given one of these little cards, which coincidentally is about the same size as a business card. It fits neatly in your wallet for you to carry it around. And my colleague, who's going to raise his right arm now to identify himself, Dr. Nick Barter, is the MBA Director at the Griffith Business School. We are now, without doubt, although Suzanne might disagree in a moment, we are without doubt the most progressive MBA in Australia in terms of our commitment to socially responsible leadership, ecological sustainability, and having a strong regional focus with our work. And our numbers are increasing. And I am very happy to cling on to the coattails of the MBA program, because if you look on the inside of this little card here, you'll see that the Graduate Certificate of Sustainable Enterprise fits neatly within the MBA program. So you can do the Grad Cert, which comprises 4 courses, and you'll get full credit for those 4 courses into the MBA program, thanks to the MBA Director agreeing to that. So we are open for business, sustainable business, and we are accepting enrolments in July. That is the end of my advertisement, and thank you for indulging me. And I'm not going to beat around the bush now. I'm going to introduce you to our guest speaker this evening, Professor Suzanne Benn, which I'm sure many of you in the audience will know her well from the famous textbook that she co-authored with Andrew Griffith and Dexter Dunphy. I've used it so much now, it's a well-thumbed edition that I have on my bookshelf. Suzanne has a background in science, a chemist, I believe, originally, but also social sciences, and currently Professor of Sustainable Enterprise at the UTS Business School, University of Technology, Sydney. Her current research interests range across corporate sustainability and corporate social responsibility, business education for sustainability and leadership, and organisational change for sustainability. Her interdisciplinary academic publications include 4 books and numerous refereed journal articles, book chapters, refereed conference papers, as well as conducting research funded through various Australian Research Council projects. She's worked with numerous business and government organisations in order to progress understanding of change and leadership for sustainability. And the title of tonight's lecture is Sustaining Business in the Circular Economy. And another reason why it was important for Dr. Barter to be here tonight is that this is a theme that we're looking to develop within the Griffith University MBA, this notion of the circular economy across the MBA curriculum. And Professor Benn is going to enlighten us tonight in what the circular economy is all about. And the hashtag for tonight, no surprises, it's hashtag circular economy. Suzanne.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeremy. I'm very pleased to be here. So it's a pleasure for me to be in Brisbane. I have family here, and I have a son with 4 children under 4. So my partner, Andrew, and I have been staying with them. So if I seem a little bit sort of not able to concentrate, living with that little tribe for the last few days is done something to my brain cells, I think, but never mind. It's all good, and I love Brisbane, so it's nice to be here and be with the family and have the opportunity to talk with you. And I had a very interesting meeting with Jeremy recently, and this possibility of this talk came up, but also because he is sharing some of his curriculum with us on a website that we run on behalf of the Australian government, which I think actually exemplifies some of the things I'm going to be talking about tonight. And that is, how can we progress towards a more sharing, collaborative economy, and that is one of the key principles underpinning this possibility of the circular economy. So I'll try and sort of bring some of these ideas together and link them into some research that we've been doing for a number of years, as Jeremy was saying, with Andrew Griffiths from UQ and Dexter Dunphy. We've been looking at how to progress change for sustainability, and now looking at that in the context of this idea of the circular economy. So, I play this role in the business school at UTS because I do have a background in the sciences and social sciences, because a lot of these concepts are inherently cross-disciplinary. And so it's really very difficult to understand how we can implement sustainability in business unless we rely on our scientists, on our economists, on our social scientists, our management specialists, etc., in order to bring some of these ideas together. So, and I'll explain a little bit more about how we're trying to do that in the context of a circular economy project during the talk. So, the key question we're looking at in terms of the circular economy is, what is the human dimension? What are the specific management approaches? What skills and capabilities do we need in organisations, and do we need sort of across organisations, if you like, if we're going to implement the circular economy? And that's something that really, there's not really any clear understanding, unless we do implement a more circular economy, what else we can do about this, the obvious problem facing the world of mass consumption. So it's clear that the future holds a lot of negative things for us in terms of all these issues that I'm sure many of you are very familiar with, from going from waste to air pollution, to declining fish stocks, to what are the impacts of chemicals acting together. We don't really understand some of the outcomes. Climate change. We don't really understand what we can do about these impacts unless we do apply a more circular way of looking at the economy. So unless we do that, we would argue the road ahead can look very grim. And this has been highlighted in several different very large surveys that have been done recently. For instance, one done recently by the MIT Sloan Boston Consulting Group looked at these key questions here and found that while many companies, many managers within companies thought that sustainability issues were indeed very significant, very few of them, in fact, had developed a proven value proposition around sustainability. I think this particular survey related to nearly 2,000 managers, and 20% had tried to implement sustainability as a business case, but had found it too hard. And that's 10% up on the survey the previous year. So clearly it's a bit of a challenge. Of the factors that led managers to change their business model, this factor here that's particularly relevant to us, resource scarcity, keeps coming up again and again in these surveys. So resource scarcity is one of the pressing issues that will cause managers to try to change their business model. They may not have much success, but they will try because of this perception of resource scarcity. So clearly many people are recognising that you need to move from the linear economy. You know, the idea that we just take something, make it into a product, take some raw materials, make it into a product, and then use up lots of fossil fuels along the way and then dispose of it at the end. So clearly a very wasteful economy in every way, including raw materials, energy, and also including what we would call the human enterprise, the human capital that goes into some of these ways that have become really entrenched in the economy. So even recycling, in fact, is a hugely inefficient waste of resources. So there's a lot of research been going on for years and years indicating that this is a very negative trajectory. And what can we do about it? So the idea that we need to shift from this linear economy into a more circular system of materials, flows in particular, but also in terms of the human involvement in these systems is now starting to become much more widespread in our research institutions, but also out there in the mainstream press, in the big business conferences. For instance, there's a lot of talk about the circular economy. There's a lot of understanding from various business organisations such as Renault. Philips moved from trying to move from selling lights to selling surfaces. Renault getting very engaged in the remanufacturing area, whereby parts that are broken down are retooled and sent back out into the supply system again. And they have evidence that, in fact, some of the spare parts that are retooled and sent back out into the system actually are operating at higher levels of reliability and efficiency. So Cisco too is now becoming involved because it is this idea that information systems, information tracking systems are one way we can try to implement this idea of circularity. So a number of different organisations, Unilever too now, if you look at the Unilever website, they're engaged in trying to implement a more circular approach into their products. So just sort of trying to unpack this a little bit. I won't go into the detail of it because there are probably people in this room who will know more about the actual technical details of this diagram than I do. I'm just trying to illustrate what we mean in quite sort of general terms by the circular economy. So this is a slide that comes from the Dame Ellen MacArthur Foundation in the UK. So Ellen MacArthur, of course, is particularly revered in the UK and has become absolutely convinced that we must move from linearity to circularity. This has become her mission in life, and she's established a foundation that is now supported by a number of those organisations I mentioned before, and also by a number of universities, including ourselves. And they're looking at how you can make these cycles of circularity work. So the key principle of the circular economy is to think about technical system flows as being separate to biological system flows. So if you keep those flows separate, you're on the way to some sort of restorative sort of approach to an economy. So, for instance, here, what they call the technical system flows, these are things like the metals, the plastics, etc. The important thing is keeping them sort of cycling through these various approaches such as, reuse, refurbish, remanufacture, recycle, etc. You keep them in a separate system, keep them apart from the biological system flows. Because here, over here, these are the sort of naturally occurring materials that, if kept separate from the technical materials, can go back into the ecosystem. So, and there's a number of sorts of processes, that and technologies now that are enabling sort of naturally recurring materials to be cycled again and again and again and again, and as long as they're not contaminating the technical side, we can then have this sort of ongoing cyclical processes that's not in the end diminishing nature. Now, that can be contrasted to the traditional linear economy. Now, you can look this up for yourself. There's a lot of material on it. I'm just giving a very cursory overview, and I certainly can't go into the technical aspects of it because, for a start, I don't really have the expertise, of course, in some of these areas here. But a lot of people who've been working in the industrial ecology area, for instance, do. And so, but that's the basic theoretical principle, the idea of keeping technical systems, metals, plastics, etc., separate from biological systems. And if you can do that, there's the potential for the road ahead not to look quite so grim. So, and of course I recognise that leakage out of all of these systems is more or less inevitable, but the idea is to try to minimise that leakage. And clearly there's also issues of energy. So for the whole system to be cyclical, renewable energy is an essential key part of it. So, this is an aspirational model, but it can be contrasted to what we see here in terms of the inevitable trajectory where you go from mining or whatever, materials assemblage down to landfill. So that's what the aim is, to get to this sort of approach here. Now, there's a number of different, a lot of articles in the mainstream press. The Economist has run stuff on it. We've written articles in the Conversation, for instance. I don't know how many of you log on to the Conversation website. So we did an explainer for the Conversation website, which sort of sets it out in quite sort of straightforward language with various links into some of this material here. There's the website for the Ellen MacArthur Foundation with a lot of material on it. But I think it's important to point out that these ideas have been floating around for a long time. So since the 70s, actually. The architects, for instance, have been working with some of these ideas for a long time. The idea of the cradle-to-cradle economy, the famous architect William McDonough and chemist Brongart have come up with cradle-to-cradle systems. Industrial ecology is a well-recognised branch of science, and of course there are also designers working in the area of biomimicry, where they're trying to design products using the principles of nature. So there's a whole heap of different specialists, academics from different areas that have sort of contributed in to what I see as the push now to try to really make this happen. And of course, our argument, and similarly here at Griffith, we see that it can't happen unless business, and therefore business academics, management academics, sort of get engaged as well. So that's what's happening now. This is Walter Stahl, who key figure since the 70s has been talking about what he calls the performance economy. And he was the person who actually came up with the idea nothing is going to work in terms of circularity unless you separate out the technical components from the biological components. Now, I won't go into this in sort of huge detail, but there's the sort of theoretical literature talks about different sources of value creation in the circular economy. And this is where the economists are really starting to get into the picture. I'm not an economist, so can't go into the technical details of that, but I absolutely recognise that one of the things they argue, for instance, that there is the power of the inner circle. By this they mean that you get much fewer inefficiencies the tighter the circles are that go from making a product to remanufacturing, recycling, etc. So the fewer steps in these cycles, in these loops, if you like, in the technical system, the fewer steps, the less you're going to lose in terms of energy and other inefficiencies. So that's, they argue that there needs to be work done to understand how to tighten up these circles. They also argue that there needs to be work done in terms of understanding how you can cascade use across industries. That is, how do you get organisations to work together, for instance, so that a pair of jeans might end up as sort of filling for furniture and then might end up in its next cycle as insulation. So how do you get those industry sectors to work together? There's another set of power, another source of power. They argue the power of circling longer, and that is designing products that have a much longer lifespan. A washing machine that can go for a lot more cycles before it passes on. But of course, there are value challenges there in terms of those calculations, because that ultimately, making that a value proposition depends on the cost of the raw materials. So some of these things, what they argue, the value propositions, are very dependent on factors that can change depending on availability of raw resources, raw materials at a particular time. Actually, that's one of the reasons that Renault argue their remanufacturing model is working, because they have been faced at various times with rapid increases in steel prices, for instance. I think one year the price of steel went up 40%. And so at this stage, that pushed Renault into looking more at remanufacturing that companies like Fuji Xerox have been doing for years, because their design trail is too long to be able to immediately deal with that 40% increase of steel. The other source of value that these people, the theorists of the circular economy, argue lies in the purity or ease of separation of materials. So the purer material, the argument goes, the longer it can last without being unusable. The more easily you can separate out the complex components in terms of what materials they're made of, the more efficiently you can recycle those materials. So that, that's oversimplifying, for a chemist, is a very complicated statement, but I'm just trying to sort of summarise where these sources of value potentially lie. And sitting in behind each of these statements has been, quite a lot of work. So this is another sort of rather complicated side that this is up on the Ellen MacArthur website, actually. So you might want to just, if you're interested, look at this yourself. But clearly there's issues in terms of the sort of global supply chain. Products that might be made in China, for instance, but the point of use is in Europe. So how do you make these loops work? What are the value challenges for that particular sort of loop? And how can you get that to that set of relationships to operate as a source of value? So there are various organisations, for instance, which are successfully manufacturing and recycling and remanufacturing in Europe, and so avoiding the problems of shipping, etc., and the energy costs, the emissions costs, transporting from China to Europe, as in this loop here. So there are carpet companies, for instance, such as Desso, which is now becoming quite well known for its complete remanufacturing of carpets. So it manufactures carpets and then takes them back and remanufactures them and sends them back out into the supply system again. You get other sorts of different sorts of loops that you need to consider, where products are made in China but recycled, remanufactured in Europe. And Renault engines, for instance, are an example of that. You get other systems where manufacturing is in China and the point of use is in Europe, but here you get products moving, different types, that cascading of products, where you get different sorts of products emerging at the end of the life cycle. And then you get the traditional linear cycle, or the linear set of relationships here. So, this is all very complicated, and I won't go into the details of this, but you can see some of the challenges that are facing these researchers and the companies that are looking at this. It's a very complicated picture. But the good thing is that each of these sorts of loops, there are companies who are actively working in it and researchers who are studying them. So I think that's all very positive. And we have some very strong examples. It's patchy, but it's strong. We've got lots of examples of companies moving away from a straight product supply of products to a product service mix. Lots of companies that are now selling services rather than just products. We've got the emergence of what we might call the sharing economy. You think Airbnb, or other sorts of examples of GoCar, etc., where the use of resources is being minimised as a result of it. We've also got here in Australia an attempt in our steel industry to try to establish some sort of certification scheme. So the Australian steel is going to be branded as a responsible product according to a set of criteria. We've got people working right along the steel supply chain in Australia, working to develop an understanding of what steel stewardship means in Australia. So if you're interested in the area, there's plenty of material available that you can look at that. But these, I think, are very positive examples of how organisations are trying to understand sustainability along the supply chain and to think of it in terms of recycling, remanufacturing and circularity. So just as I say, these are the key, this is the key principle. My throat's getting very sore. This is the key principle of the circular economy, as I understand it anyhow. And this little logo here is for our institute at University of Technology, the Institute for Sustainable Futures. And as I said before, we're working with the Institute of Sustainable Futures, trying to understand what it might mean for the metals industry in Australia. So this is an immediate example of researchers from different backgrounds coming together to try to understand what it all means. And of course, one of the interesting areas that's emerging now in terms of the metals industry relates to additive manufacturing. And there's a lot of interest in how closing the loop can be facilitated by such things, by such technological advances as additive manufacturing. Now, this is just an example of that application of this technology into the metals industry, which is, as I say, that one of the key areas of focus from this Wealth from Waste program. So the Wealth from Waste program is a major program funded by the CSIRO, and there's a number of different universities involved. So there's University of Technology in Sydney, Monash, Swinburne, Yale, UQ. I don't think I've left anybody out. And each of us are focusing in different areas. But this is what the program is doing. And this is, as I say, trying to add meaning into the circular economy as we understand it in Australia in relation to metals. So this program here is being led by UQ and from the Centre for Responsible Mining at UQ. And it's really a policy focus. So a number of economists and policy people looking at what policies we need to implement industrial ecology in Australia in relation to metals. So this one here is being led by Monash University, and they're actually trying to understand what stocks we have of metals above ground in Australia. So what have we got there in Australia already that can be recycled, and then how can it get back out into the economy? What do we need to do to get it back out there into the economy? The one we're working on is how do you develop business models that might facilitate circularity in the metals industry in Australia. So what sort of approaches to innovation? What sort of approaches to management? How do we get different organisations to work together? How do we add value? So trying to sort of look at those aspects of the value add that I described before, and how do we apply that into the metals system in Australia. And the program 4 is sort of a compilation of programs 1, 2 and 3. So this is what we need to do to go forward. So this is a major funding initiative, and it does build on work that CSIRO has already done in this area. So Australia was quite far forward in terms of understanding, particularly in relation to metals, which is quite appropriate given the amount of mining that occurs. So I won't go through this. This is just a diagrammatic version showing how the different parts of this sort of project sort of work together, and our different responsibilities, etc. The different people that are involved in it. That's Stuart White, who actually is the leader for the whole program, and he's head of Institute for Sustainable Futures at UTS. We've got an international reference panel. So obviously organisations like Sims Metal, there's the Wuppertal Institute in Germany, which is very famous for resource management and governance in Germany, and various other organisations involved in one way or the other in this area across the world. So clearly there's a lot of work to be done. The projects are trying to understand how you can develop reverse logistics and get the systems working so you can get, this is even just for a complex, the complexity of materials that are in a power drill, for instance. A power drill, 14 different components, materials components in a power drill. How do you get that? So how do you get these reverse logistics to work so that the circularity can happen? So this is just an example of the fact that given this complexity, this is the challenge that lies ahead. But given all the work that's gone into forward supply chains and increasing the efficiency of their operations, what people are beginning to realise that if we put a lot of effort into the reverse logistics, that there is a payoff in the long run. So there's the idea of sorry, I'll just go back on that one. This idea of streamlining pure material flows. So as I mentioned this before, that the purer the materials are, the more efficiently, the more productive these cycles are. So what our current research is doing is looking at what are the values of organisations that might be able to contribute into the circular economy, what sorts of change agents, what policies, structures, systems, what sort of stakeholder relations, what sort of human capabilities. How can we understand what organisations need in order to implement this, to make all these theoretical value systems work? So there's a number of quite classic Australian organisations, small to medium-sized organisations that we can look to as models for this. So I know Andrew Griffiths from up here has been working with an organisation called Rockcoat for ages. So he's written a lot about Rockcoat and how it is an excellent example of a sustaining organisation. We write about an organisation called InStyle, which is a textiles company established in Sydney, very successful, medium-sized organisation, which is applying sustainability, circularity right along its supply chain. So if you're interested, there's plenty of material you could look up these at organisations such as that. Just a bit of a plug for the recent edition of our book has just come out. This is the third edition now, in which we talk about these some sorts of concepts. We mention the circular economy, but we really relate the circular economy to what we call the restorative organisation. So this is this model we've been looking at for a long time, how organisations move from a point whereby they might completely reject outright any value that sustainability might provide for the organisation. They work against concepts such as climate change, and there's plenty of examples of big organisations that have done that. But they move then to this efficiency approach, where they're just looking at costs, to a more proactive approach whereby they're integrating sustainability into their business model. And then finally, if they're really implementing the principles of the circular economy, they move into this transformative phase whereby they're actually giving back to the community, and where they're attempting to restore some of the negative impacts that business organisations have had. And this might seem like a pipe dream, but in fact there are organisations that, as I said before, that are working in this sort of phase. And there are organisations that in some ways might be still in the more proactive phase, just applying a more strategic approach, but are heavily engaged in trying to help university students, help school students understand how sustainability might be applied in their business context, And in that case, in that example, we would say they are actually trying in some way or other to restore some of the damage that business has done to the environment. So we've looked at what are the key business opportunities in terms of getting organisation to this sustaining phase, and what do they need to do? And the things that we've really come back to again and again is the building a constructive culture. So focusing on a culture, developing a culture where employees are committed to the organisation, where there's a constructive idea around building human capital, building relational capital, and there's a positive relationship between the members of the supply chain. There's emphasis on openness and debate, innovation, etc. And we've also looked at some of the business benefits for this. So there's some evidence, including some of our own work, for instance, that companies that provide employees with the ability to get engaged in these sort of sustainability-related initiatives tend to keep their employees for longer. Employees are more committed to the organisation and overall have a higher opinion of the organisation. So that is some sort of concrete evidence that companies that do participate in leading the game can see business value. Now, what does this have to do with the circular economy? Well, the circular economy is the restorative phase. So an organisation that is fully in the sustaining phase, according to this model of ours, will also be an organisation that's engaged strongly in the circular economy. And I think it's really important to point out that it's not just the environmental area that the circular economy has so much interest and so much to offer, and there's why so many different people are interested in it, because there are social returns as well. So an organisation such as Desso Carpets, I mentioned, becoming quite famous as a result of its publicity in this area, is employing local people. It's engaging in the local community. There are sort of positive social aspects that are coming out of those sorts of local cycles. There's also the requirement that they upskill and maintain their employee level of capabilities in order to do that locally. So there's a sort of a what we might call an aspiration for those organisations to enable their employees to be engaged and to thrive along with the organisation. So new approaches to management, we would say certainly in terms of the human sustainability, and that model of ours really relates to both human and ecological sustainability. And what we've found in all the research we've done over the years at many different case studies is this focus on thriving. Organisational development these days means a focus on thriving, getting employees to think for the future, to get them to co-create with managers, co-create in teams, come up together with some idea of what can be done about a more sustainable approach to their particular enterprise. So this particular area of research is being done by some well-known organisational psychologists, organisation development specialists, particularly at the University of Michigan in the US. So, I mean, we're sort of taking from that work as well. Now, I won't go into this sort of detail because I think I seem to be, how are we going for time, Jeremy? Yeah, probably just sort of winding up now. But if people are interested, the work that's done on human sustainability and thriving is done by Gretchen Spreitzer who's a wonderful professor at the University of Michigan, and I can recommend her work to anybody who's interested in this idea of how do you get employees to thrive. It goes beyond engagement, she argues, and she's got very strong evidence to indicate that it goes beyond engagement. Engagement is in the present, thriving is through the future. So, I won't go into this, but I'll be leaving the lecture with Jeremy anyhow, so you can have a look yourself. I also just want to finish off by saying that, you know, across the world, really, there's numerous people who are looking at the circular economy in the context of a new approach to capitalism. And so a number of these people are well-known economists, and there's a group, for instance, headed by Michael Townsend, and there's papers available on their website. You can look these up. A number of different economists, thought leaders are coming up now with new brands of capitalism, and all very interesting. I couldn't possibly go through them all, and anyhow I can never remember everything they say, but I'll leave the lecture with Jeremy. If you're interested, you can have a look at this. Each of them have got material up on the web. David Corton, for instance, top one here, very famous economist. John Elkington, equally well known, the originator of the triple bottom line. Jonathan Porritt, of course, Lord Porritt, well known in the UK. Each of these people are coming up with new ways of understanding capitalism which link back into the circular economy. Michael Porter, of course, shared value. Won't go into that because most people, everybody will have heard of Michael Porter, and a lot of you will have heard of his idea of the shared value. That business needs to share value instead of take away value from various aspects of society, that corporate performance needs to be reconceived in terms of sharing value with its stakeholders. So again, there's a lot of material available on that. Okay, and other aspects of the sharing economy too. I mentioned at the outset the idea of collaborative consumption. There's the wonderful Australian woman, Rachel Botsman, who great TED talk that you can look up on that, the collaborative consumption exemplified by Airbnb, GoCar, etc., lots of other models, all based on trust, principles of trust, and heavily based on IT. So the mesh economy, very similar, and the makers movement, again, a sort of a sharing approach. So, sorry, my voice is beginning to run out, and anyhow, I've talked enough. But I just really wanted to introduce you to some of those principles, and there's plenty of other material there for you to look at if you're interested in following up on some of these ideas, which are indeed very broad-ranging. So not any one of us owns any of those, the whole of that range of ideas. So anybody like to ask a follow-up question or whatever? Oh yes, just one last thing. That there is the website I told you about. It's our attempt at sharing, and the Australian government's attempt actually, because they're supporting it. It's a website which is dedicated to sharing in the tertiary community. So us sharing our teaching materials and working together in terms of sustainability across the universities. So.